In September of 2024, actually September 21st, we began a series entitled The Story, where we've given an overview of Scripture because we understand that history is His story, meaning God's story of how He has worked in the world and through humanity, through His nation, to bring salvation to all that are lost. Since September 21st of 2024, 24 messages have been preached on the story. Now, I usually don't do such a long series because I tend to get bored with myself. And so, but this has been so exciting to me, and we've been using the Bible Engagement Project that you can also access on your phone and online as a guide for it. Now, I didn't strictly stick to what I chose the title and the theme, but didn't necessarily stick to what they were trying to bring out. I just asked the Lord to bring out what we needed for that day. So we started in September of 2024. The journey begins, and then God is my creator, Adam and Eve and sin. God judges sin. Abraham and Isaac trust God, Jacob, Esau, and Esau, God's plan. Joseph forgives his brothers, Moses and the burning bush. The Exodus from Egypt, the Israelites in the wilderness, the Ten Commandments, and then Joshua and the Promised Land. And that took us Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, through the whole first part. God calls Gideon, which was Judges, Ruth and Boaz. Samuel listens to God. Israel demands a king. David and Goliath, which the youth did today, because I heard you online, which I was okay with. Pastor Rowe gave me a warning for that. That was great. Solomon chooses wisdom, Elijah and Baal's prophets, where he called down fire. Elisha and the widow. Jonah goes to Nineveh. Daniel in the lion's den. The last time I preached before Mother's Day, Esther and the king, where is God? And today and next week, we're going to look at Nehemiah rebuilds the wall. And so this is the last message this week and next week. What happened was, as I was preparing, I thought, if I use all the material that I have, it's going to be way too long. And I thought, I'm just going to make it into a couple week series. So we're not going to get to everything, but Nehemiah is the last one, and here's why. Throughout that time, God was working in Israel, and God established a covenant with Israel, and it was very simple. He would bless them if they would keep His commands. Now, which part of the covenant, or which side of the covenant didn't do what they were supposed to? Israel. And because they didn't keep the laws of God and the covenant with God that could be narrowed down into love God and love your neighbor, they were constantly in turmoil. And at one point, they had accepted false gods, foreign gods, into their worship. And we talked about that. We would call it syncretism. They took a little bit from here, and a little bit from here, and a little bit from there. They never stopped necessarily worshiping Yahweh. They just added Baal, they added Asherah, which is just as evil, okay? And so he basically said to them, if you want to live like the Babylonians, I'm going to let you live with the Babylonians. And the Babylonians came and took them out of the promised land that was so important in the story. Okay, so important from the Exodus, and then Joshua taking over, took them from the promised land, and they lived in Babylon for a long period of time. But what was happening is gradually the Israelites were allowed to leave and going back to the promised land. Okay, and that's where we find Ezra, which we're not going to spend a lot of time with. He was the priest, and Zerubbabel was the governor, and this is where Nehemiah comes in. So this is when they go back to the promised land. Now, after this series in the summer, I'm not going to continue on with the series in the New Testament. We're going to pick that up in September. We'll pick up. So in the summer, I might do Summer of Psalms again and pick different Psalms. There's 150 of them. So we have some options there, and just walk through those and those that are going to be sharing with us in the summer. We're going to get to the New Testament story in September, but this is the last one because Nehemiah is leading the people to restore the walls of Israel. So the Israelites had been exiled. Nehemiah himself became a very powerful leader. Many had gone back to the promised land but weren't doing well. So his friend's brother went back to Israel and reported to Nehemiah. And this is in Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 3. They said to me, "Things are not going well for those who returned to the province of Judah. They are in great trouble and disgrace." And here's why. "The wall of Jerusalem has been torn down, and the gates have been destroyed by fire." Basically, you weren't much of a nation if you didn't have walls. Walls in that time represented prosperity and power. And here was the nation of Israel that was God's people. The same people that God led Moses to lead them out of Egypt. The same people that walked through the Red Sea on dry ground. The same people that took over the promised land and God provided miraculous victory. We looked at Gideon, God turned him into a warrior and all of these things. This same people were now disgraced amongst the other nations because their wall had been torn down and not repaired after a long period of time. Now, again, you have to grasp this. They were God's people that were sent to be a light to the other nations. The other nations, pagan nations, could look and say, well, what kind of nation is that? They don't even have a wall. More importantly, what kind of God do they serve that won't protect them and provide for them? Do you see? So this was a big issue. This was a big issue that was going on here. When I heard this, Nehemiah says in verse 4, I sat down and wept. In fact, for days I mourned and fasted and prayed to the God of heaven. What we're going to talk about today is overcoming the impossible, because the situation that Nehemiah was faced with was impossible on his own. There was no way, no matter how powerful he was at the time, that he was going to be able to do this by himself. And sometimes we find ourselves in impossible situations, and we play it over in our mind over and over again. Well, if I do this, well, that's not going to work. If I do this, that's not going to work. If I do this, that's not going to work. We feel like we're in an impossible situation. What I want to give you today through God's word is hope. That no situation that God is involved in is impossible. That we can feel a lack of hope at periods of our time, but we're never hopeless because God is with us. So if you're facing an impossible situation, I want to show you steps to take in overcoming impossible situations. The first step is passion. How bad do you really want your situation to change? How bad do you really want your situation to change? Now, I'm not thinking of anybody that's done this here. This is a semi-true, semi-not, just as an exaggeration. Especially now that I have online, I come right to the service. But there were times in pastoring in 35 years, 3 minutes that I need to go to the pulpit, lead the service, and Pastor, I've got to talk to you. It's super important. Well, I can't meet with you now. I have to start the service and there are people waiting and things. I said, but I would be happy to meet with you after church. I'll have more time to spend with you and interact and pray with you and for you. And the response is, oh no, I can't do that because I have a birthday party. And then we begin to question, how bad is the situation and how passionate are you about the situation? See, Nehemiah saw that the walls, he heard, and it wasn't like, well, that's too bad for them. He took it as a personal affront to his God and to his people, and it led him to weep. His passion was so great for God and God's people and Nehemiah's people that he wept. And it says that he didn't weep just for a moment, that he wept for days and he mourned, and he fasted, and he prayed to the God of heaven. That's what we're talking about when we're in an impossible situation. Where do we have the passion that it's going to take to lead us to brokenheartedness over the situation, which will ultimately lead us to prayer to God? See how passion leads us to prayer. Passion leads us to brokenheartedness oftentimes, and that's what was going on in Nehemiah's life. He didn't cry just simple tears. He cried from the depths of his being. Have you ever been there? Do you understand what I'm talking about when things are so hard and so difficult that you feel it not just emotionally, it's like so bad you feel it in your body. That's the depth of passion that he had. He was fine. Catch this. He was fine. He was wealthy and powerful, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, but he had such a passion for God and his people that he wept from the depths of his being. And again, he didn't cry little tears. Like I cry at movies, I cry at TV shows. We watched Nona's last night. Have you seen that on Netflix? I had to stop it several times because it spoke so deeply to my heart. That was a joke. I guess you didn't see it, or you're not Italian. If you're Italian, you get what I'm saying. How many have seen that? Oh, quite a few of you. Did it just touch your heart, or was it just me? I was like, oh, as they're eating family style, and all the food, and they're cooking, and they're yelling, and my poor wife. Well, I don't have time to list all the reasons that you should feel bad for her. But one of the things was her family was very quiet, very wonderful people, very quiet. She married into an Italian family. And whatever the opposite of not quiet is, that was our family. And then the first time she came to Thanksgiving, and her mom's a wonderful cook. It had nothing to do with food. They had plenty of food. First time she came to my mom's house for Thanksgiving, she cried. So overwhelmed. All day she cried. She told me years later, I almost called my dad to tell him to come get me. That's how overwhelmed she was by everything that was going on. But in Nona's, it just spoke to my heart, and it was so wonderful, and it just reminded me of that. So I cried at that. I'm not going to tell you all about it. I don't want to spoil it for you. And I don't know, like they might have cursed and stuff in Italian. So like if you watch it and you speak Italian, and you say, oh, pastor saw, no, I didn't know what they were saying in Italian. I only know a few words. I eat Italian, but I don't speak it. So if you're Italian and you get the curse words, as some of you would because you use them often, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I don't want to know what they were saying, okay? You don't have to tell me what they were saying. But nice movie, I cried. Well, there was a period in time where I wanted to watch Boy Meets World. Have you ever seen that? And I watched it when the kids were young, or probably just watched it on my own. Well, when it was on whatever Netflix or whatever streaming thing at lunchtime, and I eat lunch at 12:30 every day for the past 35 years within a certain thing. And so I would go home and I would eat and I would watch Boy Meets World. And I would what? I would cry. Puffy eyes, red eyes. I'd come back to the office and Kelly would look at me and goes, did you watch Boy Meets World again? You've got to stop that, she would say. You've got responsibilities. I'd cry. Those are funny stories. That's not what Nehemiah was going through. And that's not what some of you are going through. And I want you to know I make light of simple tears just to be funny. But the reality is sometimes our tears are so painful that we can feel it in our bodies. You know, the psalmist teaches that God collects all of our tears in a bottle. And he knows what you're experiencing. And he wants to speak to your heart today to say whatever you think is impossible is not impossible with God. Has your passion for this situation led you to prayer as it did Nehemiah? Has your passion for this situation gone beyond just your own needs and with an understanding of that how it affects God and his people with weeping and mourning and prayer? But the first step is passion and prayer. The second step is finding partnerships. Because impossible situations you'll never be able to get out of on your own. Okay? There's not a time in Scripture that God didn't use teams to accomplish his purpose, right? From Genesis, he created Adam. Adam named all the animals. At the end of the day, or however long that day was, he said it's not good for man to be what? That we need partnerships. When Jesus sent out his disciples, he sent them out what? 2 by 2. Paul traveled with people. He always did. Barnabas traveled with others. We always need partnerships in our walk with God. Now, I want to show you something here that's amazing, that the first partnership that Nehemiah seeks is with the king, the most powerful man in the region. And we're going to jump ahead to chapter 2, verse 1. Early in this following spring, in the month of Nisan, well, none of that matters, I was serving the king his wine, and I had never appeared sad in his presence. Pastor Rick touched on it. How important was the wine taster? Super important. How expendable was the wine taster? Very expendable. He had to be trusted so that if he would taste it, and if he died, then the king wouldn't drink it. It is basically that, okay? But also, if he died, the kingdom would carry on. So he had a very powerful position, very close to the king. The king trusted him, and we'll talk about that. But I had never appeared sad in his presence. And in that day, if you would appear sad in the king's presence, you could literally be killed, because the king didn't want any sadness in his presence. But I want to draw you back. He was so passionate, so brokenhearted over the situation that was going on in Israel for God and God's people, that he even appeared before his appearance, although he thought he was hiding it. Others could recognize even the king. And so the king asked me in verse 2, "Why are you so sad? You don't look sick to me. You must be deeply troubled." Deeply troubled. Nehemiah, understanding to appear sad in the king's presence, the next phrase says, "Then I was terrified." I guess I wasn't hiding it as well as I thought I was hiding it. And I was terrified because he literally could have been killed on the spot. So I replied, this is after prayer, seeking partnerships. I replied, "If it pleased the king, and if you are pleased with me, your servant, send me to Judah to rebuild the city where my ancestors are buried." That's a big ask. He was desperate, you see. He was desperate. A birthday party wasn't going to keep him from accomplishing what God wanted him to accomplish. And I'm not against birthday parties. It turns out when you're an adult, you can order a birthday cake any time of the year. It doesn't even have to be your birthday. I didn't know that till like a year ago. Never crossed my mind. I'm not against birthday parties. Let's just get that straight. But when passion overtakes you, it sets your priorities in order and leads you to prayer. He said, "If it's okay with you, king, and that you find me pleasing, send me to Judah to rebuild what my ancestors had buried." That was huge, because years previous, the same king declared that the walls would never be rebuilt in Israel. He wanted to keep them weak and powerless. He was asking a king, a president, a politician, would you reverse your public stance on something? That's what he was asking. And he said, "If you don't mind," he goes on in verse 8, "please give me a letter that would, with your signature on it, that I can pass through these enemy territories with your authority." So would you change your decree? Would you give me your authority? These are big. But he was so passionate about God's people, it led him to prayer, understanding he couldn't do it on his own, that he needed a partnership. He went right to the king. Not only does he ask for the policy to be changed, not only does he ask for authority to go through. Watch this in verse 8. I love this. And please, while I'm here, let me, ask. And please give a letter addressed to Asaph, the manager of the king's force, instructing him to give me timber. I will need it to make beams for the gates of the temple fortress, for the city walls, and for the house for myself. And the king granted these requests because the gracious hand of God was upon me. Would you let me go? Would you give me your authority? And would you mind paying for it? That's a big ask. But even the king knew that Nehemiah had God on his side. But the king also said yes because he knew Nehemiah. Now this is going to be big, and I'm going to try to be as gentle as possible, okay, which is sort of like a velvet-covered brick that's lost a little bit of its velvet, okay? Why did the king say yes? Because Nehemiah had proven himself faithful, trustworthy, reliable, and honest. Nehemiah was easy to partner with because he was a man of character and integrity. In general, people are willing to help people with character and integrity. When the fires in Los Angeles were taking place, I heard a comedian say, and he was being semi-serious about this, he said so many of his friends reached out to him and said, hey, just come and stay with us. And it wasn't just because he was well-known and wealthy. He said the reason they wanted and they opened their home to me is because the last time I was there, I didn't steal everything that wasn't tied down. People are willing to reach out and to help people with character and integrity. People are willing to take that extra step for people that are passionate about the right things. Because this is where it's hard for me to be kind. You can be passionate, but if you're a fool, according to Proverbs, if you're a fool, then all it produces is more folly. See, passion in the wrong things produces multiplied wrong things. See, passion only helps us when we're passionate about the right things. And what was Nehemiah passionate about? His own place, his own prosperity? No, he was passionate about God and how these broken walls represented the God of the universe. He was passionate that God's glory would go forth. He was passionate about God's people, the people that God loved. He wanted them to be protected and safe and prosperous. He wanted them to be able to withstand the attacks of the enemies all around there. He was passionate, and you can be passionate, but if you've lived a foolish life, it just leads to more folly. If I say it softly, maybe this will help. But if you've lived foolish, produced folly, and 100th time that you've asked for help, when you finally receive the no, it's not the person that says no's fault. It's the person that says no finally establishing healthy boundaries because they love you enough to say, no, we're not going to continue on in this foolish pattern. I'm not going to be part of your foolishness. That's tough now. It's tough. But you'll never get someone out of folly by allowing them to continue to be foolish. And you want to know whether they're foolish or not? If you've given them wise advice in the past and they refuse to accept it, then they're a fool. I'm a communicator. Somebody's got to say it. But look at it. Look at Nehemiah. Why did the king say yes? Because he was trustworthy. Because he was honest. He had proven himself over a long period of time. The passion of a fool only leads to more folly. Proverbs 14, 16, and 17 says, the wise are cautious and avoid danger. Fools plunge ahead with reckless confidence. 17, short-tempered people do foolish things, and schemers end up hated. But the passion, watch, of the godly leads to partnerships and provision. The passion of the godly leads to partnerships and provision. So we know the rest of the story. I'm going to get to it next week, the rest of it, but he gets what he needs. The king pays for everything. He gets there. He looks at the situation, says, this is impossible. I can't do it on my own. So here's what I need. I need every family to just take care of the wall by their house. You know that's part. And so everyone was responsible for their own area. If they built a bad wall, it was their family that was at risk. Okay, he was a genius administrator. And so they built this wall because he understood this impossible situation he couldn't do on his own. He needed partners. And so he invested in the people, and they stepped up, and they built the wall. And the wall ended up being built faster than anyone thought humanly possible, because what happens is when we do our part and then offer it to God, he involves the supernatural. You see? The supernatural. Watch. They run out of wine at the wedding. Mary says, Jesus, he tells the servers, go get water, bring it to me. Could Jesus have supernaturally just made water happen? Yes, but they had to do their part, and then he would do his part. Lazarus dead for 3 days. King James, if you grew up in Sunday school, he stinketh. Right? Isn't that what it says? He stinketh. 3 days. Jesus could have said to the stone, because he's Lord of all, stone, roll away, Lazarus come out. Instead, he looked at the people and said, roll away the stone. You do your part, and I'll do my part. What happens in impossible situations that we pray, we ask God, what am I to do? And then we wait and see what God is able to do. So back to the great theology of the movie on Netflix called Nonas. There was a former nun that was one of the cooks, and they faced an impossible situation, and she knelt down right in the middle of everything. They're like, what are you doing? She said, I'm praying. And then she gets up and she goes, sits down. They're like, well, what do we do next? And she said, we wait. We've done all that we can do. Now we wait. So God had pointed Nehemiah to build these walls. It was impossible within himself. But this is the last point I want you to see, is that when God points, he will provide. When God points, he will provide. Karen works for the missions director. I don't know what his title is now. Oh, thou great Fabian. Whatever his title is. Is it missions director? You know, Fabian hurt my feelings one time. And I wanted everybody to know it. He said to me, I remember when you were a youth pastor. I said, you do? He says, yeah, I was still in the youth group. That hurt. And I'm holding it against him so I can be real bitter when I get older. But oh, thou great Fabian, she works for him. I think he works for her, but anyway, working with missionaries all the time. That's what they do. They're a liaison between the district, and they help our missionaries get to the mission field. And she knows this more than I do, but I know there have been times in missionaries, and they need the finances to get where their passion is leading them. And they're getting down close to it. What I can do now, because I've seen it, is say this, listen, if God has pointed you, he'll provide for you. And I can't tell you the whole situation. I just heard it this morning. There was a missionary couple in desperate need of finances. They had like 3 days to get what they needed. And they were sending out feelers to all the different churches. I found out this morning that one person stepped up and paid for everything that they needed, because God is the God of the possible. And he can do, I'm going to get it right, exceedingly abundantly, more than we could ask or we could imagine. Let me close with this. What's the impossible situation it seems that you're facing? Are you passionate enough about this situation to go to God in prayer? And sometimes that's easier than asking for partners. Because we can go to God, we know he's great. But when we ask for partners, we know we're not. That's why it's so difficult. You'll have to think on that. But when you go to God and you ask for partners, when you live a life of integrity and character, God will have people there to help you. And then when he gives you the assignment and he points, he will provide. And he can even use a godless king to sign the papers, to pay for what he said he would never do. Because our God is not the God of the impossible. Our God is the God of the possible. So be encouraged today that God is not against you, he's for you. That we are not against you, we are for you. And the last thing I'll say is Pastor Joe every week holds up the card about prayer. They have books, Janet and her crew. They have books of answered prayer. Am I right or wrong? They write it down and they pray and they wait. And God does what only God can do. If you need prayer, pull out one of those cards. But I'm going to ask you to do something even more. I'm going to ask you that as we're singing this song, would you let us as the pastors partner with you in prayer today? The power doesn't come from us, it comes from God. But would you be willing to say, my situation is so difficult, I'm going to stand, I'm going to take a step, and I'm going to come forward because I'm acknowledging I need prayer and I need a partner. And we'll do that. Pastor Joe, myself, Pastor Rowe, Pastor Rick will stand here and we'll pray with you and for you as we continue to worship God. And I believe and I know that God hears every prayer, and in his way and in his time, he answers every prayer. Your situation is not impossible, because God is the God of the possible.